A lot of geographers study faraway places. Study China, for example, and they essentially are contrasting China and China's economies and Chinese cultures with American cultures and stuff. Nothing wrong with that, very interesting. But for some reason or other, I got interested in studying the United States and looking at differences within the country. So I've always been curious about whether there is any truth to this idea of Southern hospitality, and if so, how that came about, all those kind of things. So I've written a book about the Midwest, for example. I don't know if you ever thought about the Midwest. It's another vague term. Everybody uses it. Academics use it. Ordinary people use it. Nobody knows exactly what it means, but it seems to be important. At least when I go places, I tell them I'm Midwestern, and they say, "Oh, like that explains it." So I got curious where the term came from and what it's meant over time and all that kind of stuff. So I wrote a book about that. I wrote about the Plains and about Kansas and all kinds of places around here. But since I retired, I got more interested in Pleasantville itself. And so I spent the last 7 to 8 years writing about Pleasant Hill and its various guises. And so next door here is the Pleasant Hill Historical Society. I actually think they should change its name to the Pleasant Hill Historical and Geographical Society, because what they do is, of course, what I do. They study places. So with that in mind. Now, almost to where I want to start, but before I do, I want to acknowledge somebody who's here, who are here. One, my daughter's here. So for those of you that knew Bob and Harriet, this is my daughter, Amy. All the way to Kansas. And the other thing, some of you may not know, I got married about a year and a half ago. It's a really strange story in some ways. But I ended up marrying this girl that I dated in high school. And we have a little saying as we got back together and fell in love again, that we think we may have set the world's record for time between kisses. Just about exactly 60 years. So, Donna Shoemaker is the new maybe one more acknowledgement. My new brother-in-law, Cliff Shoemaker, is also here. And he made a real sacrifice. He's a minister, and he gave up church in order to be here today. All right, enough of that. Now, what I want to talk to you about today is the origins of this Pleasant Hill. This Pleasant Hill is right before us. I'm looking right down First Street here. In my experience, hardly anybody ever thinks about the origins of their hometown. Pleasant Hill for me, and probably for you, is. Always has been. You just don't think much about it. But of course, if you do think about it, you realize there has to be a specific origin somewhere, or a reason for it. We just don't talk much about it. So, if you start from there, and then say, well, let's think about it for a minute, the next thought that people usually have about Pleasant Hill, or wherever their hometown is that it is, it's a place that just some people came to a long time ago, and they settled down. They farmed a little, they started a store or two, and they worked hard. And so Pleasant Hill people, the Pleasant Hill pioneers, made Pleasant Hill. Well, that's a pretty good story, and in some cases, that's true. And it happens to be true actually for the original Pleasant Hill, which my grandparents always called Old Town. Now, I don't know whether all of you know Old Town or not, but Old Town Pleasant Hill, the original Pleasant Hill, was out by the cemetery. That's why the cemetery is there, right next to downtown. And its history is pretty much that. Just people showing up, starting a store, starting some farms, gradually the thing got a little bit bigger. You can kind of tell that if you look at the street names out here. There's only 2 east-west streets that are left, Wright Street and Rice Street, W-R-I-G-H-T and R-I-C-E. Wright Street went past Joe Hamilton's grandparents' greenhouse there and over to the Big Kellogg's greenhouse. So it's a little bit of Wright Street that's still there. Rice is just to the north of it. Went past Dennis Dodson's house in my youth. I don't know who lives out Wright Street anymore. But they were named after pioneers. William Wright was the guy who founded the town. Martin Rice was a farmer from out by Lone Jack who was an amateur surveyor, and he laid out the town. So that's local people being celebrated by the local streets. The north-south streets the same way. Line 7 used to be called Main Street, which, by the way, is why this street is called First Street, because there already was a Main Street, so they had to come up with a different name for this one. And it's flanked by Independence and by Lexington Road. Very practical names because those are the roads to Independence and to Lexington, which are the two supply points for Pleasant Hill back in the old river days. So all that made sense. Now, we get to Newtown, what's called Newtown, right down here. And you say, well, did the same kind of thing happen? Was it just the old pioneers that came down here and started the town? Well, a few of them did come down, but they're really not the ones who started the town. They were just sort of drug along with it, but they were definitely not the instigators. The instigators were outsiders, and that's the thing that is often the case with towns. The people who live in the towns have almost always forgotten that, and maybe never ever knew it. Their great-great-grandparents maybe knew it, but not them. Consider, as a way to get into this, the street names again. And this is how I happened to get into this thing. Maybe 20 years ago, I started wondering about the streets in Pleasant Hill. Consider, for example, Taylor Street. Where the hell did Taylor come from? So I started looking at the old histories to see if I could find who Mr. Randolph was, or Mr. Jeffries was, or Mr. Campbell was. And the only one of them I was able to find was Armstrong. And there was a Mr. Armstrong who owned all this land that the old part of town here is laid out on. And he sold that land. And so he got a street named after him. But he's the only one. All the rest of them had nothing to do with the old time Pleasant Hill. So take a few of those streets, for example, here. Look first at Taylor Street. When you start chasing that down, that was named after a guy named George Taylor. And George Taylor was the president of the Pacific Railroad of Missouri, which later became known as the Missouri Pacific. This is the one right out here outside our venue here. Another street name is Paul Street. Paul Street is the one that goes past City Hall and the Memorial Building up there. That's after a woman named Therese Paul. Therese Paul was the wife of George Taylor and was the granddaughter of August Choteau, who was the founder of St. Louis. So there was some money involved in both of those kind of things. There was a man named, let me get it right here, Thomas McKissick. Thomas McKissick was the chief construction engineer on the Pacific Railroad of Missouri as it came across. One of his main assistants was named John Randolph. So you start to see that there's a pattern involved here. That this railroad was pretty deeply involved if they were there in powerful enough terms to have streets named after them. So that got me thinking. Turns out the real key to all of this is not Randolph or McKissick or Taylor, but it's actually a guy named Miller, who would be a little bit easy to forget unless you study the old maps. There was a Miller Street in Pleasant Hill, and Miller Street is what we today call Lake Street. The name was changed in 1890 when a man named Zenas Leonard, who built what we today refer to as the Wallace Funeral Home, he built that house and he built that lake, Lake Leonard. And he built it in 1890, and the city was so excited to have this recreation area right at their doorstep that they changed Miller Street to Lake Street. So that's an interesting aside, but Miller is what I want to talk to you about. Miller, his first name was Edward. So Edward Miller is the guy, and he was the chief construction engineer of the railroad before history. He was the guy who did everything. In fact, probably a better name for this town would be Edward Miller's town, because he did the whole thing, and he had a lot of help, a lot of money backers, and he named streets after them. So we're getting back to all of this. I looked up Edward Miller. He was a native of Philadelphia. He was a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, and he was a highly respected railroad engineer. He laid out the Pennsylvania Railroad, for example, which was one of the big, powerful, important railroads of the past, because it went over the top of the Appalachian Mountains. It took quite an engineering feat to make all of the curves and such to get a railroad over that big barrier. But he did, he got famous for it, and then the Missouri Pacific hired him to make the route from St. Louis to Kansas City. Okay, he's the one, he created Pleasant Hill, as we know it down here. He got all kinds of cronies to help finance him, take part in his scheme, and of course he named the streets after those people who provided the money for him. As a college professor, I can tell you the same thing happens at universities. That's how they make buildings, is the people who have finance everything. So, that stage here I wanted to talk to you about is the history of this railroad, and how it got started and how Pleasant Hill then fits into the thing. The Pacific Railroad was a dream of St. Louis businessmen. It started in 1850, and their idea was to run a railroad first to the gold fields of Colorado, and then to the even more lucrative gold fields in California, and to make St. Louis to San Francisco the great highway across the western half of the country. So they started this in 1850. They got some money. They got a land grant. But they had troubles. They had troubles in part because the Civil War came along, and in part because they didn't have enough money to do all of the building that they projected. So they had issues. One of the biggest issues they had, that again eventually becomes important for Pleasant Hill, is what general route to take. They had a choice. They could either follow along the Missouri River, the south side of the Missouri River, or they could go overland, a little bit further south of that. And both ways had advantages. If you think about it, I think the first thing that comes to mind is the advantages of the river. You'd be building on a floodplain, for example, or just above a floodplain on the terrace. So the building would be pretty easy, be pretty flat. You also would be going through lots of towns that already existed, like Jefferson City and Boonville and Lexington, that already had a considerable population that you think would help feed into the railroad. So you think that would be the thing to do. The other thing, though, and the reason that route had some problems, is that those towns were not about to give you any money to build a railroad through them, because they essentially expected the railroad was going to come anyhow. They were in the prime position, from their point of view, had to come by them. So, what the hell, we'll just sit back and wait for it. On the other hand, if you were an inland town, say a county or two south of the river, you'd realize, my God, we're going to die on the vine unless we get one of these newfangled railroads to come through. And the railroad, I hear, might come through if we vote a big bond issue. And so the railroad said, do we take choice A here and build along the river, or do we take choice B and go for the money? What they did was classic commercialism, I guess, half and half. So if you look at the railroad today, you'll find that from St. Louis to Jefferson City, it's built along the river. They ran out of money at Jefferson City, so they couldn't use their land grant anymore. They'd already done that. And so they started casting around and say, who wants to offer some lucrative money here? And they found a guy by the name of George Smith, who was the founder of Sedalia. And George Smith raised $100,000 in bonds in Pettis County if the railroad would go that direction. And so the railroad said, sure. And so the railroad goes from Jefferson City through California, Missouri, and to Sedalia. Now the game was on, and they started saying, well, what do we do from here? And it turns out that the next town up the line was Warrensburg, and Warrensburg had a man by the name of Benjamin Grover, who was a senator in the Missouri Senate, and he's the one that greased the wheels to get the route accepted from Sedalia toward Kansas City. So they said, hell yes, let's go to Warrensburg, which is pretty much straight west of Sedalia. So they come to there. Well, now it's going to get interesting for us, because you're in Warrensburg, and you're going to Kansas City, because clearly that was the place you had to go, and then you could follow the Kansas River west from there. How do you get there? Well, I need you to sort of have a little geography game in your mind here, and try to picture Warrensburg in your mind, and then picture Kansas City, and draw a straight line from one to the other. And when you do that, it is a very nice route. It doesn't cross any rivers. It goes more or less through Lone Jack. Not quite, but almost. And clearly that's the way they should have gone. It was the shortest. It was the no-bridge route. It would have been the cheapest to build. But of course they didn't. Instead, they came to Pleasant Hill. And Pleasant Hill, again, sort of keep this mental map going for a little bit further. If you envision that line from Warrensburg to Kansas City, that becomes, in my thinking, sort of a hypotenuse of a triangle. If you go straight west from Warrensburg to Pleasant Hill, and then go more or less straight north from Pleasant Hill to Kansas City, you get the rest of that triangle. So, what they ended up doing was taking that indirect route, that right-angle route, straight west to Pleasant Hill, and then more or less straight north to Kansas City. Why in the world would they do that? Answer, again, money. If they took that Lone Jack route, they tried, but they couldn't get any money. That route goes essentially through Lafayette County, where Lexington is the seat, and through Jackson County. Neither one of those counties would want to give them any money, or Johnson County either, because they already had the river at Warrensburg. So Lexington people said, hell no, we're not going to vote for this. The railroad will come through Lone Jack, not through Lexington. We don't want it. Kansas City said the railroad's going to come to us anyhow. We don't need to put up any money. Pleasant Hill offered $150,000. And the railroad said, sure. Now, one question leads to another. Consider this, for example. Why in the world would Cass County ever come up with $150,000? For one thing, this was the time, this was late 1850s, early 1860s, a lot of unrest, a lot of border raids, not much money, anyhow. But more important, just think about the county and where the people were in the county. There were some people in Pleasant Hill, but not anything close to the majority. Harrisonville was far bigger, and there were people in Austin and Drexel and all kinds of places. And you think none of them would want to vote for this thing because the railroad was going to affect only just one little corner of the county, not the county as a whole. So you think there's no way in hell a vote issue like that would ever pass. And yet it did in 1857, in May of 1857. So, what goes on? There's not many records left, but there are two stories that have survived, and some people think one is the answer, some think the other. I got to think both of them may have been a factor. One, that is, they're both quite interesting. One is that there was a political deal made. And the political deal, supposedly, was that Pleasant Hill was threatening to use its influence in the legislature to start a new county. A county that would be centered on Pleasant Hill. It would take parts of Johnson County and parts of Lafayette County and parts of Jackson County and so forth and create this new county. And of course, people in Harrisonville wouldn't like that. So the story goes that Pleasant Hill said, well, we won't pursue that new county idea. Richland County was its name, by the way, if you vote for this bond issue. And so, according to one story, that's how the bond issue got passed. The other story is maybe more all-American. It's just outright bribery. Apparently, there was all kinds of money that was just sort of thrown at people if they would vote this way and that way. There's a 1917 history of Cass County that maybe some of you have seen. That bribery story is in it. And that guy was a judge in Harrisonville who wrote it and possibly had knowledge of the thing. So that may be more likely the true story than the first one. I don't know. Anyhow, that's how we get to the railroad coming to Pleasant Hill and that money issue. All right, now, ready to move forward just a little bit and get to the next stage of this thing. Think about what Pleasant Hill would mean to these railroad people, why they engineered this thing besides $150,000. Well, for one thing, Pleasant Hill is about equidistant between Warrensburg and Kansas City. 25 or 30 miles one direction, 25, 30 miles the other direction. Railroads had substantial towns about that same distance apart. Jefferson City to California, California to Sedalia, Sedalia to Warrensburg, all those are about 25 miles. I think I left out something there. But they're all about 25 miles apart. And steam locomotives, they needed servicing every so often. And the railroad built towns that all expectations were that it would rise to at least 2,000 or so in population. So there would be that kind of plum in creating Pleasant Hill, or coming to Pleasant Hill and having that bonus. But there was more to it than that. Besides just being in this nice location on the general 25-mile kind of surface, there was also the fact that it was at this big bend where the road turned from going west to going north. That meant that it was a jumping off point, or at least a potential jumping off point, for freighters, for taking trade goods down to Harrisonville, or to Butler, or even to Fort Scott over in Kansas, a military post, down to Nevada, maybe as far as Joplin. So none of those places had railroads, but it was a big opportunity to set up wholesaling places here in Pleasant Hill and make a lot of money, maybe even before the railroad got to Kansas City. And Kansas City wasn't all that developed at the time. You still could hold on to some of that trade, perhaps. So you had the 25-mile, pretty good-sized city. You had the potential for trade. And then one more. And the one more is the biggest thing of all. And that is that if you could create a more or less a new town, you could make all kinds of money off of selling lots in that town. You could lay out a main street, for example, and sell business lots. And then you could lay out residential areas and sell residential lots. This was a huge money-making thing for railroads all over the place. I spent most of my professional time in Kansas, as some of you know. And in Kansas, I'd say for two-thirds of Kansas, the western two-thirds of Kansas, that area was not settled before the railroad era. And so the railroads building across Kansas, for the most part, were building through uninhabited areas. And they could lay out the towns wherever they now wanted to. And they were able to make railroad junctions wherever they wanted to. And they could control town companies. They planted towns, they laid out all these towns, they sold lots, and they, for most accounts, made more money off of these towns, speculation, than they did off of the railroad itself. Well, Missouri was different, because Missouri was pretty much already settled by the time they started building railroads. But Pleasant Hill becomes a very interesting exception to that rule, and therefore quite noteworthy. And I certainly never suspected this growing up. Because what these railroad people did, they got the $150,000. They said, we're coming to your town. And the agreed upon thing was that they would have come from Strasburg, about halfway between Strasburg and Pleasant Hill, and they would have encountered a little branch stream in the Big Creek called Duncan's Branch. Now, you probably don't know Duncan's Branch, but if you follow it up into the area of Pleasant Hill, Duncan's Branch is dammed up in eastern Pleasant Hill to form what used to be Baldwin Lake before it became Baldwin Mountain Lake. So that little depression, as you go down past the old golf course, and you get a low point there, that's Duncan's Branch. So the railroad was going to come up there, and it was going to go through the original Pleasant Hill site, just south of the cemetery, where the land falls off there into a swale and then over into the Big Creek Valley. And so all of that would have been the field. But they didn't do that. They decided instead to come right here. And they laid out the town as a place. Do you have the maps out? Oh, I've got a few handouts that I thought we had. I didn't coordinate this.
I think we did that.
Okay, pause for a minute.
Yeah.
Good things come to people who wait, I guess. Had time to study the maps and get food and everything. One thing, when I was talking about this switcheroo, I didn't say, I should have given you a little bit of background. The old Pleasant Hill almost didn't exist by the time the railroad came. This deal was made in 1857 with $150,000. But by the time the railroad was getting here, it was 1865. And the old Pleasant Hill was almost completely wiped out in 1863 as part of this bitter Civil War. It's not well documented, but if you look carefully in some of the surviving newspapers, you can put it together. What happened was, about 10 days apart, first Cole Younger came to town, and Cole Younger decided that he and his group would burn every house in town that was a Unionist. And so they burned about a third of the houses in town. 10 days later, a guy that was in the Union Army named Henry Palmer came back. There was a Union station here, but he was out on patrol. When he came back, he found this devastation, and he said, I'm going to burn all of the Confederate homes in town. And so he burned another third of the homes in town, which left, and there's, I can tell, about 20 homes, perhaps, at the outset in the town. So the town, when the railroad came through, almost was no town anymore. So it wasn't that hard a thing to do for the railroad to make the switch. They wanted to do it to make a bunch of money, and I think the poor people in Pleasant Hill said, well, geez, what the hell? We can't find City Hall, especially in our position as we were in the mid-1860s. So the switch was made. And on that first big map that you have there, you can see in general how the thing was put together. The railroad bought, more or less was given, they paid $1 a piece for 2 adjacent 20-acre tracts. It's labeled Railroad Edition on that map. And they bought this land from 2 landowners, obviously 2 local people. And on it, they laid out First Street here. And if you come look at how the 20 acres plats are on the map there, and then look at the streets, you can see why they laid out the streets in this direction, not following the cardinal directions, because that way they could maximize space within their rectangular plots. So they did it, and as a result, we've got a Main Street that flows. So short-term gain, long-term loss, they got their money. Okay, now another thing you notice on that map is that Edward Miller, Jim Purvis was just reminding me of this. He bought the 160 acres just to the northeast of the downtown, and he paid $10,000 for that to this man, John Armstrong. Okay? And on it, he laid out the first, the second, the third, and the fourth Miller's initials. And he made lots of money off of those that I'll give you some details on here in a minute. He did, sort of being a good businessman, said, I want most of the money for me and my cronies, but I'll let the little people in a little bit. So if you look there just to the, on the west side, you'll see a Meekins edition, and you'll see a Van Hoy's edition, and they'll see a Howard's edition. And off on the east side, you'll see a Klein and Todd's edition. Those were all local people. And he gave them the opportunity to have some additions. But if you think about where those additions are, and look at the land and so forth, Miller clearly had the prime property. They just got tidbits, leftovers, if you will. Now, okay, Miller needed money to pull off this. And so we can go back to the street names and find out some of those cronies. And so we talk about our Taylor and our McKissick and our Randolph. But there's also some others. One of them is a guy named Campbell of Campbell Street. That was Robert Campbell. Robert Campbell was a very rich St. Louis businessman, and he He is the source of the $10,000 that Edward Miller used to buy the land from Armstrong. So he was the backer. If you go to St. Louis, by the way, the old Armstrong or the old Campbell House is still there. One of those old flesh Victorian age things that you can tour for a couple of few bucks, but not all that interesting. But it does still exist. There was another man by the name of George Boardman of Boardman Street. Boardman was a Boonville man, a land speculator. He was the registrar of the Boonville Land Office, and in the 1860 census, he listed himself as a land speculator, as a business, and he had $77,000, which is a lot of money in 1860. If you look on the map next to Boardman, you'll see a very short street called Welsh, where the elevator is. Welsh was a Philadelphia man, another rich guy, a trustee of the University of Pennsylvania, and a president of the Board of Trade in Philadelphia. He clearly advanced a lot of money to put Pleasant Hill together. And then one of my favorites is a man by the name of Charles B. P. Jeffries, Jeffrey Street. Jeffries was Miller's assistant and also his son-in-law. So you get family communism in here as well. He handled the lot sales in Pleasant Hill. So all those Miller edition things were sold by Jeffries. He had dollars too that he could invest and did invest. His father, in turn, had been the governor of the British island of Nevis in the Caribbean. So there was some pretty good money. Now, one more thing. Bob wanted me to mention this. When this whole area down here was planted, they were going to name it the town of Wyoming. And the idea was that the old Pleasant Hill existed out there. This is a new place. We'll just give it a new name, and that'll be fine. But unbeknownst to them, before they got around to platting it, they were just busy making money, I guess, and didn't bother with the plat. The few remaining folks in Old Pleasant Hill expanded their city limits. And so, if you look at old maps of Pleasant Hill, it has this sort of funny shape to it. And the sort of L part of it, that's the old town, and then to get the new town included. 2.5 miles away, but they made this big annexation. The railroad people decided not to fight them. They still were going to make their money anyhow. And so really the only thing that survives of Wyoming is Wyoming Street that we're sitting on here today, which is okay. It does bring up one more aside. Everything leads to everything else, but I don't know whether you've ever wondered about why Wyoming. And when I started thinking about all these other street names, I started wondering about Wyoming too. And I thought, as you probably are thinking, for some reason or other, somebody had been west and fell in love with rodeo or something, and so named it that way. But that's not true, because the territory of Wyoming dates to 1869. This is earlier than that. And both Wyoming Territory and Wyoming here were named after, I'm quite sure, although there's no absolute proof, after a place in Pennsylvania called the Wyoming Valley. And the Wyoming Valley is a big structural depression that's full of anthracite coal, and it's where the town of Scranton and Wilkes-Barre are, Joe Biden's home country. He was always up there visiting. And that's where Edward Miller did a lot of work before he came here. So I'm quite sure he just decided to borrow that name and apply it here. So if you ever wondered that. Okay, so now you've got some pretty good idea about how all this was put together. One more thing you might look at on that map, on that first map. Miller was a pretty smart guy. He, I think, laid out the town well. He bought some land that was upland, so it didn't flood, but it wasn't too hilly. It's a pretty nice area where all those streets are we've been talking about. He decided that he would have one area for the elite people to live in. And if you look carefully at that map, you'll find the area that is north of Oak Street and west of Campbell Street looks a little different than the other streets in the Miller's Edition there, because it doesn't have alleys running through it. You see the alleys on the other ones, but no alleys over there. That's because these were really big lots. There were 6 lots on each of those blocks. So that's where the big houses were going to go. And then on Jeffrey Street and Randolph Street, that's where the ordinary houses would go. And as far as I know, there's only one surviving house that still occupies one of those big lots. I don't know who lives in it now, but when I was a kid, it belonged to my great-great-aunt, Maine North. And it's on Lake Street in the corner of Myrtle. If you get a picture of where that is. Anybody know who lives there now? I don't know who lives in there now, but that's still a big house. All the rest of those lots have been subdivided at one time or another. But anyhow, he had a place for the rich people. He gave lots out to the churches. He did everything he could do to be a good person, but still break things money. Okay, now, to conclude this, I thought I could give you a little bit of an evaluation of how this speculation went and whether it was a success or not. So, most of the stuff you can look at will be on the other side of that map. But let me tell you a couple of things before that. As near as we can tell, by 1867, after the railroad had been here a year or so, the town had about 3,600 people in it. So, pretty good size. And an awful lot of money was made in this town in 1866 and 1867 before the railroads were coming south out of Kansas City and sort of cut off all this trade territory. So we did that. Pleasantville also was able to take advantage of that bend in the railroad by getting its own railroad to the south. And there is a railroad. You follow down First Street here and you'll cross it. It goes to Harrisonville and went all the way to Joplin. And so for a while, Pleasantville was a division point on the Missouri Pacific in the 1870s and early 1880s. We had a roundhouse, we had all kinds of railroad people in town, and a fair amount of money was made in hosting those railroad people and having that trade area to the south. But the real thing, though, that Pleasantville got from the railroad, even after Kansas City developed and overwhelmed it, was the railroad service here was good enough with that railroad and then later the Rock Island, as you know, to attract some industry. And when I grew up here, Pleasantville was known as a friendly town of famous industries. Not all that great a slogan, but still reasonably intact. And there were these 3 big industries. There was the greenhouse, there was the Seattle foundry, and there was the hatchery. And all of those were very dependent on the railroad, and they wouldn't come. Harrisonville had nothing like that. We had far superior ability in that line of technology. So we got those, and those were very big for the town from the 1870s right down through when I was a kid, probably until 1965 or 70 when those things began to fade away some. Now, looking at this one final way, look at it from Miller's perspective and the money available. On that second map, you can see a map of land sales in the what's the northern half of that railroad edition. The railroad paid $1 for that land, and the total for those lots that they got back was almost $20,000. So about $1,000 an acre. The railroad people and Edward Miller made off of this downtown area as they sold it. A couple other things you might want to notice on that kind of history about the old town. The depot originally is not where the depot is now. The old depot burned in 1901, and this depot was built in 1903. The old depot was at the other end, at the other crossing, and that's why that's called Commercial Street down there, was because that's where the depot was. That's where they thought the town core would be. And as you can see on that map there, those lots near that corner and on the railroad side, that's the lots that were worth the most money. Definitely they wanted to pay more money on the east side of railroad side of First Street than they did on the west side. And you can see the old depot locations on there. The names I put on that map are not names for the most part that you would know. They were almost all land speculators that came in from the outside. Quite a few of them were from Jefferson City, Sedalia, and those kind of places. Some of them from St. Louis, a little bit further away. So they held them for a while during the boom years, and then they sold them off. There's only a couple of exceptions, and that might be worth pointing out here. One is that there's a couple of lots that you can see there that I've labeled D/S. That's for, D is for a man named James Dunn. James Dunn was a pharmacist and started a drugstore here. His partner Shepard didn't last very long, but Dunn stayed, and his name was James Dunn. His son, George Dunn Sr., continued that business, and George Sr.'s son, George Jr., continued that business another generation. And finally, in 1945, George Dunn Jr. sold out to Alva County. And so, if you know Campbell's drugstore, that was the old Dunn drugstore. Going back almost to the beginning, the original Dunn drugstore was right here on the corner of the building that fell down. You can see the TS on the map there. Dunn is the one that built that first made two-story building. Another one, I guess it shouldn't be mentioned because of my family, is there's a Norton on that chart. And that's my great uncle. He ended up being quite a rich guy, moved to Kansas City and became a banker. He invested in two different properties, as you can see there. One of the one about halfway down on the railroad side of First Street there is where he had a wholesale grocery, and they made a ton of money in 1866 and 1867. Then sold out and became a banker. If you've ever seen the Citizens Bank sign on the west side of First Street, he's the founder of the Citizens Bank, and he's probably most famous in the town for having built the North Opera House, which was the opera house before the Kellogg Opera House was built, and it's still standing at 135 down here at the end of the block. Church, as this used to be probably known, where the Oddfellows met for years and years in the second story. Second story was, it was the opera house, and it became the lodge hall after that. It was there from the 40s and most of the 30s. Well, Don's father played it. Butcher's father too. Let's see. One last little thing here. I'm just about done. But another name that might ring a few bells with is you'll see the name Gamble on that list of speculators here. That was a man named Hamilton Gamble Jr. Hamilton Gamble Sr. was a governor of Missouri. And his son came out here to be part of that speculation from Jefferson City. And he actually was one of the first representatives from this area to the Missouri House of Representatives. He served for a little while, and then his opponent accused him of cheating, and because he had Confederate veterans voting for him, and Confederate veterans for a while were banned from voting. And so he got tossed out of office, left town, became a lawyer in California. But before he left, he built a house. And he built a house that became known as the College. And College Hill is where the old Gamble House was. And some of that stonework is now on the Historical Society, or the Historical Society Museum. But that's just an aside that you might want to know. The last thing is, in terms of that last little chart, you can see the residential lots. And you see the winners and losers. You see that Miller was a big loser. He made quite a bit of money there if you read that last column. The other people, Van Hoy and so forth, made a little bit of money. The only one who lost money was poor Flying Todd, whose development was clearly too far away from the downtown. I grew up in that area. I think it's now called Pine Street. When I grew up there, it didn't have anything. It was just Quality Hill. And we lived there. Anyhow, I thought you might enjoy that perspective. It's a really interesting town, and to me, it has a lot of uniqueness that I never suspected. And this business has fascinated me for a long time. So I thank you very much. I thank you for your indulgence. I don't think I'm skilled with this damn microphone, but I'm happy to take questions. Anybody has any questions like that? If not, we can just split up and talk as long as you want. I didn't mention the gap. Well, I know the origin of the gap. Do you know the origin of the gap? The origin of the gap is from a book by a man named Hamlin Garland, who was an early writer about Wisconsin and the general Midwest. He was one of the kind of the first people who founded the term Midwest. And he wrote lots of stories, and one of his stories featured a place called Molasses Gap, which was not a poor place, but just an out-of-the-way house, out-of-the-way place. He was writing about Wisconsin, the hill country of southwest Wisconsin, and this was just a minor river valley where it's a little bit backward, but not totally backward. And for some reason or other, in the 1920s, that name was hung on this. We know exactly when it came about. Probably the timing is such that the 1920s was the time when the town decided that it ought to have street numbers and street names and have all those posted. So the street signs went up for the first time. And apparently, a guy who owned a hardware store in another building that's not there, where Eastside Saloon was, corner where Pruitt was, right there across the street, south from the north building. There used to be a hardware store there, and he apparently made these signs, and he stuck one up and just said Molasses Gap. And so it came down. It seemed to have been a town, a sign of the region or anything. But that's where it comes from, and I don't know any more than that. There's still a lot of mystery involved in it, but clearly the term persistent. Now, there's Happy Hill. I haven't found anything about that. I haven't found anything about Quality Hill, where I was from either. You know the highway did run up Happy Hill, correct? That cut is a new cut. The original one followed the L's there and Happy Hill. Anything else that we want to talk about? Yeah, Jim? Is this beyond the Kellogg property? Straight north of Campbell Street, just south of the cemetery, or different way?
Yeah, it's up in that area. I'm trying to think of the cemetery, and then just northeast or northwest of that, it goes down that draw. Part of the subdivision up there is just kind of trying to figure out how to say it, but I've heard there used to be a spur in Canada.
Well, it wasn't a river that was intended to go from here to Mexico. The river was not intended to go from They never built that. I'm not quite sure how it was going to get out of that. It might have been around that river, I'm not sure. The lake I'm talking about is now the new houses are around. It used to be kind of straight north of Campbell Street. That was built by George Kellogg. And he had a big dairy operation. He used to be a wonderful farmer that set up in there, and that was also part of his operation. He was trying to establish a model dairy farm. George Kellogg died young. I think he had all kinds of ideas that might have been very big for the town if he had lived on dairy being one of them. He also was growing mushrooms. He was in the big mushrooms for a while before he decided to concentrate on flowers. Yes, it's called Harding Dairy. I know that. I knew people who worked there, but it's not horribly old. I don't think it's 19th century. I think it's early 20th century, and probably died about 1959, something like that. It just was too small. It was Harding Dairy was a Kansas City operation. They had plants in different places around the city. Well, I guess we'll officially call this done. Thank you for your time.